Chapter 5. Lady Catherine motioned for Richard to take a seat next to her at the table. "Do you have his key?" Richard shook his head. "Not yet, but I will, as soon as he has returned and his man has made his bath ready." Lady Catherine raised a brow at him as she took a sip of her tea. "I will have it," Richard assured her. He knew a thing or two about Darcy, and one of those things was that the key to Darcy's room never left his sight, unless he was taking a bath. It was likely due to the fact that ladies such as Miss Bingley were actively trying to ensnare his fortune. To have taken the key this morning, or even last evening when he had been in Darcy's room, would have alerted his cousin that something was afoot, and that would not do. "Was he still in high dudgeon this morning?" Lady Catherine asked as she placed her empty cup on the table. Richard nodded. "I could barely draw more than a dozen words from him, and the majority of those words were not at all nice or proper." "Did you have to flirt with her so much?" Lady Catherine gave him a mildly disapproving look. It was not the first time she had questioned her decision to involve Richard in her plan. He was so much like his father. How many times had she and her sister endured their brother's merciless teasing, until one or the other quit the room in a huff, or succumbed to tears? It was as if he could not, or would not, read the signs that he had pushed too far. He was always repentant, however, and after he had married, he had finally learned the acceptable bounds between being mildly annoying and utterly provoking. She credited Lady Matlock with that accomplishment. Richard did seem able to rein in his pestering on most occasions, and especially with the fairer sex. But when it came to his brother or Darcy, he occasionally overstepped his bounds. From the way Darcy had left the room yesterday, and had been silent and disagreeable the rest of the day, Lady Catherine was certain that Richard had indeed pushed Darcy well past any tolerable limit. "It was what you said to do," Richard protested, "and it had been a pleasant enough task. Miss Elizabeth was delightful, and being a burr under Darcy's saddle was always good for a smile or two." However, he did have to admit he had never seen Darcy quite as put out as he currently was, at least not by something Richard had done. Wickham. Well, there was a man who could cause as much consternation as Darcy presently displayed. Perhaps Richard had gone a bit too far in his game. The purpose of the attack was, after all, to provoke, not decimate. Lady Catherine sighed. "True. At least we know I was correct in my assessment of his attachment to the young lady. He's half in love with her already." Richard laughed. "No, my dear aunt, you're incorrect. He is completely besotted. He even tried to tell me why I should not pursue her, and in a very high and mighty fashion, condemning her connections and her family. The whole while he was rubbing his hands on his trousers and tugging at his collar." He leaned back in his chair. "Darcy has never been good at speaking ill of the ones he cares about." "That is because he is a proper gentleman." Lady Catherine's chin rose as she said it. "My sister would not have raised him to be anything less." Her eyes narrowed slightly as her lips curled into a teasing smile. "Unlike my brother." Richard's mouth dropped open. "I am capable of being a proper gentleman. I just choose not to be. It is so dull." Lady Catherine chuckled. "That is precisely what my brother would tell our father." Richard shrugged. There was no denying that his father and he were alike, both in looks and temperament, and as far as he was concerned, that was not an imperfection. Quite the contrary. His father was well liked and successful, and not solely because he was an earl, but because he was an earl with an exceptional character and a pleasant personality. Lady Catherine looked at the clock. "Miss Bennet will be here in 1 hour to practice." Richard gave a sharp nod of his head. "Darcy will be back in half an hour, if he's holding to schedule, which I assume he is." Lady Catherine rose from her seat. "Mr. Collins will be bringing me his sermon at 2, and we will take tea together. Do not be late." Richard smiled. This was a tea he would not miss for any inducement, for it promised to be a memorable affair. Elizabeth stopped at the gates to Rosings. She did not want to practice, and she most decidedly did not want to enter that house. She did not even wish to be on the grounds. It was all in too close a proximity to that man. She stood for 3 minutes complete, contemplating if refusing to do as Lady Catherine had directed was worth the long and nonsensical scolding she would receive from her cousin. Being barred from Rosings was not a threat, but rather a consequence for which to wish. How was she to even look at Mr. Darcy with any sort of composure after hearing what she had heard? And to think, she had been considering that he might not be as horrid as she had first deemed. She shook her head. Feigning civility, even to the likes of Mr. Darcy, was better than enduring a diatribe from her cousin, for she knew that it would not be one rebuke, but an unending litany, recited and expanded upon as each new day dawned. Therefore, with an enormous sigh, she lifted her chin and marched to her doom. "Good morning, Miss Elizabeth," Richard greeted her as she came near the house. Elizabeth curtsied and returned the greeting. "I am here to practice, as I was instructed to do." There was something not entirely pleasant about Miss Elizabeth this morning. Her eyes were dull, and her smile had no spark. "My aunt can be demanding," he said, as he tilted his head and studied her expression. "You're not unwell, are you?" "I have a slight headache," Elizabeth admitted. "However, it is not enough to render me unable to please my cousin's patroness." She had attempted to use her headache as a reason to avoid Rosings, but Mr. Collins would not hear of it. According to him, a bit of music would likely cure all her ills, if the glorious walk to Rosings, and knowing the favour of one so great as Lady Catherine had been bestowed upon her, did not do so first. She smiled sheepishly. "My cousin can also be demanding." Richard chuckled and accepted the explanation, but felt that more was amiss. However, there was no way to inquire further without being thought meddlesome. He extended an arm to her. "Allow me to escort you to your instrument." Elizabeth could not help smiling at the flourish of his free hand as he waved it toward the house. Why could his cousin not be so amiable? It was as if the two were opposite sides of the same coin, one dour and grave and the other affable and bright. "I must admit that I'm selfish enough to be grateful for my aunt's insistence that you play," the Colonel said as they walked. "There are far too many stays here that are dull. A new friend and music do lend a certain delight to this visit." He led her up the grand staircase and toward the family wing. "It is only when Mrs. Jenkinson is required to play, or Georgiana is with us, that there is anything as pleasant as music about the house." "No one else plays?" Elizabeth asked. Richard shook his head. Anne's skill at the piano was passed on to her by her mother. He leaned closer and whispered, "No matter how much Aunt Catherine insists she would have been a proficient had she practised, it was not meant to be, or so my father says. But you mustn't tell her I said so, for I will deny it if you do." He turned as his Batman, Mr. Stone, approached. "Did you find the missing item?" he inquired, but then held up a hand to prevent the man from answering. He needed Elizabeth only to hear a reason for his leaving her to find the piano on her own. He did not need her to hear any of the discussion about the item that was missing, because it had been taken at his request. He turned to Elizabeth. "I must apologize. There is a matter that requires my attention. 3 doors up on the left is where you will find what you need." "Oh, of course," Elizabeth replied. Richard turned toward Mr. Stone, but not so far as to not be able to see Miss Elizabeth's progress. "Do you have the keys?" Mr. Stone handed 2 keys to Richard. "And the bell?" "It is disconnected," said Mr. Stone. "From all 3 rooms?" Richard began moving down the hall as Elizabeth reached the door he had directed her toward. "Yes, sir." "And Darcy's man?" "He is resting uneasily below stairs, but unwilling to cross Lady Catherine." "He knows the purpose, does he not?" Richard stopped and waited until Elizabeth had entered the room he had told her contained the piano. Then he hurried toward the door and carefully locked it, almost as soon as it closed. "He does," whispered Mr. Stone, "but he fears he will lose his spot. I assured him that you and Lady Catherine would not allow it. Yet he is nervous." Richard pulled his man down the hall toward the servants' stairs. "No one is to open that door, or the 2 next to it." "The instructions have been given," Mr. Stone assured him. "No one is to come to this floor until you have given the go-ahead." "Excellent." Richard turned and looked back toward the door he had just locked. The handle was jiggling, and there was a soft knocking. Oh, Darcy and Miss Elizabeth were going to be angry. He blew out a breath. "I do hope they are in a forgiving mood, once they have been released," he said. Mr. Stone chuckled. "I would have thought that you would have considered that before undertaking this scheme." "You can be replaced," Richard growled. Mr. Stone shook his head. No, I cannot be. Your father has promised my father that I will be your man for the duration of our stay in His Majesty's forces. He grinned at Richard's sly smile. However, I realise that you could make my stay unbearable, and for that reason I will wish you well in this endeavour. I await your command. He saluted smartly and, pivoting on his heel, left Richard to watch the hall on his own. Richard pulled a sofa from where it stood near the servants' stairs to directly in front of the door to those stairs, and took a seat. It would be a long watch, but he must be certain that no one interfered with the plans that had been set in motion. Have they been captured? Anne asked quietly, poking her head out of her room, which was just down the hall. He waved for her to join him. They have been. There has been rattling of the door, as well as a few knocks, but nothing further. Darcy has not bellowed? Richard chuckled. Not yet, and I am fairly certain it will be a while before he does, since he is likely very improperly dressed. Anne's eyes sparkled. Do tell. Richard leaned back and patted the seat next to him, eager to share his tale.